Hey, PLO 5 card mastermind, how is it going? My name is Ryan, aka Fitz, and today we're going to be doing a video talking about 4-bet pots, post flop on the flop in particular, looking at some frequencies and some stack off thresholds. So let's go into the video. I'll just start off by saying all the examples are going to be cutoff versus button 4-bet pot, where the out of position player, the cutoff is the 4-better. And I thought it would be a little bit too much to cover both in position and out of position being the 4-better. So maybe in a separate video, I will do that. But for now, this video is going to be just on this one situation. And we'll start off by looking at our unpaired boards as specifically the out of position player. And the really easy thing or the convenient thing about these types of board textures is that we can pretty much shove our entire range as the cutoff player on most boards. And that's because a big portion of our range as the 4-better on these board textures has or is ace-ace. And that's really good because on our unpegged textures, ace-ace in 5 card will often have enough equity to stack off every time. By betting, we obviously have some amount of fold equity. We don't have much. And because the overpair will have some kind of backup, even if we are against a hand like top 2 pair, for example, or a set, we are going to have some additional equity and thus enough equity to stack off. There are a couple of exceptions on some of the board textures that we have access to, which is going to be King 8-7 and Jack 10-6, both two-toned, where there is going to be some checking. Hopefully by the time this video goes out, there will be 4-bet pot solutions live for you guys. But there is, again, these two board textures having some checking. And it might seem a little bit strange, especially when you look at a board, say like King Queen 8 two-tone, that isn't going to have a checking range for the cutoff player. So there is a bit of strange stuff happening, but my assumption from this spot is going to be that the reason why we have a checking range here is basically because our blocker effects, we're only doing this on two-tone boards. All rainbow boards will pot the entire range. But basically, what's happening with our blocker effects on a two-toned board is that when we have a very trashy ace-ace, it's very likely that our opponent is going to have a ton of equity against us. And when we have a really strong hands like ace-ace and the nut flush draw, we're very, very likely dominating our opponent, and it is making it fairly frequent that our opponent folds, or at least much more likely our opponent folds. And as a result, the blocker effects actually really play a big part on these board textures, and thus they sort of change our strategy a little bit. But with all that in mind, having mentioned that, obviously the solver is choosing to do the strategy because it is high EV, and it will always choose the highest EV strategy. But the thing to ask ourselves when looking at the solution is it actually worth implementing a checking strategy on these boards? So I ran a couple of different sims. Well, we have already the GTO sim that was run on Jack 10-6, but I also ran a sim where I basically removed the checking option for the out of position player on the same board texture, and he's supposed to shove his entire range as opposed to what would be around 80 to 70% of his range. And you can see here that there is not a very big difference in expected value for the cutoff player if he chooses to shove his entire range. In fact, it's only going to be 72 big blinds per 100 of EV difference. And if you see that the cutoff already has over 4,000 big blinds per 100 in EV, it's really not that big of a deal. And the total, if you compare it to the total pot EV, you'll basically see that we only lose about 1% of the total pot share by choosing to use a 100% shoving strategy on this particular board texture. And thus, I'm going to advise for you guys to basically simplify to shoving your entire range on unpaired board textures. So that's for the 4-better of the out of position player. Let's have a look at the in-position player and his defending range. So I guess it really depends for the in-position player what kind of the dynamics of the board texture are in terms of our stack-off range. So the more connected or the more dynamic a board texture is, the more we lean to pretty much stacking off with our entire range. And that's because when we have a piece of the board, or sorry, when the board is more dynamic, because our 3-bet call range is so condensed, it's so double-suited heavy, it's very likely we're going to have some kind of interaction and thus enough equity to stack off. So let's have a look at a few examples on a couple of different board textures. So if we have a look at a board texture of King Jack 6 two-toned, we're only folding 6%, and some of the lowest EV stack offs here are going to be a hand like Ace 9 7 6 5. So basically bottom pair with the backdoor nut flush draw, and also a little bit of backdoor straight equity down the bottom of the part of the hand, and then also a hand like Ace Queen Queen 9 9. So a double paired hand with the nut gut shot and a backdoor flush draw with 3 spades is going to be also a very marginal stack off, but it is going to be plus EV. And then if we have a look at this other board texture, Jack 7 5, two tones, only 8% folding here. A hand like bottom pair with the backdoor nut flush draw is good enough to stack off, and a hand like top pair with a weak backdoor flush draw is also good enough to stack off here. So you can see here quite a fair amount of bet folding from the, quite an amount of stacking off, I should say, from the in-position player on these very dynamic board textures. And if we move on to what are going to be some more disconnected board textures, we start to have a little bit of a higher frequency because we are going to struggle to interact. And as a result, our opponent's ace heavy range is going to have a lot more equity against us, especially our weaker portions. So thus we're going to fold a little bit more. We have a look at some more examples on King 6 3, for example. Here we are going to be folding 22% on this rainbow texture, and a hand like Ace Jack 9 7 5, so the nut gut shots with a weak backdoor flush draw, or a hand like bare bottom pair are going to be the fringe candidates for stacking off. They're not very high in EV, as I've mentioned, but they are going to be plus EV. And a board like 10 7 5, 10 5 deuce two toned, we are going to be folding 15% with some stack offs like King King with the backdoor flush draw and a pair blocker, and Ace King Queen 7 5 is going to be bottom pair with the backdoor nut flush draw as well. It's good enough to stack off here. So lastly, I just want to cover ace high boards very quickly. We obviously are going to have a very high frequency of folding between 40 and 70%. This obviously makes a lot of intuitive sense. Here, the out of position player has so much ace-ace in his 4-betting range that we are going to obviously struggle a lot should there be an ace on the flop. We have a look at some example board textures here. You can see Ace King 5 is going to be the example that has the most folding in our simulations here. And basically what we're looking for on a board texture, like an ace high board texture, where the out of position player has a lot of ace-ace, we want to have a hand that has some ability to outdraw that hand or make the nuts against it. So that's really important. And on Ace King 8, it's so likely that we are dominated. And it's very hard for us to have a hand that has enough equity. We're obviously going to fold quite frequently. So even a hand like Queen Jack 10 9 6. Wait, I can't even read. Queen Jack 10 9 8 with 2 backdoor flush draws is going to be a very low EV stack off, even with the nut wrap and 2 backdoor flush draws. It really is going to be, again, very difficult to find hands we want to stack off on this texture. A big difference from Ace 6 5 two-toned here, where we can continue a lot more, and that's because we have more of those hands in our range that are able to stack off. So here, a hand like Queen Jack 10 8, so the bare nut flush draw is going to be a very just good enough to stack off, which might come as a bit of a surprise, but you have to remember, obviously, we are going to be up against ace very frequently, so not having a pair blocker is going to significantly decrease the EV in stacking off against our opponent's range. One thing to mention as well is that on the ace high boards, look out in particular for when the ace is unsuited, because when the ace is unsuited, that's going to play into the favor of the 4-better, as he's going to able to have hands like ace and the nut flush draw much more often, whereas on a board like Ace 6 5, it's very difficult for him to have that, and as a result, our flush draws are going to have a lot more equity. So that'll be it for unpaired boards. Let's move on to straight boards. And with our straight boards, we generally speaking want to be using a shove or check um, line. We don't really want to be betting small. The out of position player will pretty much never bet small, and the in position player, he does have some infrequent small betting going on, but I think it's pretty okay to just simplify our strategy to pot or check or shove or check, however you want to call it. And in terms of if we look at the out of position range, there's going to be some board textures where we are able to range bet on, and that's generally when the in position player is going to struggle to interact with a particular board texture. So a board like Ace 5-4, obviously an Ace High board is going to be quite good for the out of position player, but even at a board like 7-4-3 Rainbow is quite good for the out of position player, because in 5 card, unlike 4 card, or more so in 5 card, there's going to be less 3 betting with hands that contain 5, 6, 7, 4, all these low cards, all these wheel cards. And as a result, we don't really, the in position play doesn't interact very well on a board like 7-4-3. Whereas in 4 card, if you come from a 4 card background, you would obviously know that these kind of board textures, the in position range is going to actually do reasonably well on in some 4-bet pot scenarios. But in 5 card, that's not the case. And again, the out of position player can't shove his entire range on these boards. But as we sort of get to the more high or middling textures of straight boards, these cause a bit of a problem for the cutoff. If we look at a board like 9-8-5, we are checking 50% as the cutoff and 80% on Jack 10-9 two-tones. And basically, I think intuitively, if you come from a 4-card background, you would understand that these board textures are never really good for the 4-betters ace heavy range, because unlike on unpaired boards, if we do have aces on an unpaired board and we don't have a very strong made hand, and our opponent does, we still have equity against that. But on a straight board, it's very often likely that with weak aces, we are heavily dominated and our hand is effectively dead. So we have to be very, very careful, especially on boards like Jack 10-9, where not only is there a lot of straights available, but also we don't have those straights, and the in position 3-bet call range interacts very, very well with those sort of Broadway to middling straightening cards. And you can sort of see the evidence of that in the equity graph. This is for Jack 10-9 two-tones. You can see the red line is the button play. He's going to have a massive equity advantage. He has around 60% equity here. And as a result, again, we probably can simplify to checking range very frequently on these boards as the cutoff player. So let's go into a bit of a quick deep dive on this board texture here of 9-8-5. And what you can see here from the frequencies right away is obviously, we mentioned before, the cutoff player doing a lot of checking around half his range, but also a very low fold from the in position player. We've established, again, these board textures are very favorable for his range. Even if he doesn't have a great made hand, he's often going to have some kind of nutted or near nutted equity or some kind of robust equity, and thus he can stack off very frequently. The out of position, though, this is obviously not the case for him, and thus he's going to have a very high check fold frequency. And once he does decide to check, the in position play is going to be betting at a very high frequency. I think I'm very much in the camp for always simplifying to a range bet as the in position player here. If you think about the way most players in practice structure their 4-betting range, it's going to be less likely to have those kind of ace high rundowns like ace queen jack 10-9, for example, and more weighted towards ace-ace. Thus, they're going to struggle on this board texture and check fold too much, or have hands that just basically doing very poorly, even if they do decide to stack off. So I think advocating for always betting pot here, and probably always stacking off given the way people play pre-flop, is going to be a good strategy. In the solver, there is going to be some small betting happening for in position, but I think it's okay to simplify to pot, as I mentioned before. And as the overall strategy, the main thing to remember is that because we are at a low SPR scenario and there is checking involved, it does mean that we are going to have a polarized checking range for both players in theory. And we also basically want to put our slow plays, or we want to include a bunch of slow plays in our checking range. Out of position is more incentivized to do this because the in position player can check behind and always realize his or always see the turn card, whereas the out of position player does not have that advantage. And a good example of a hand that both players will check is going to be a hand like Queen Jack 10 7 6. So the nut straight with a wrap redraw and the backdoor flush draw. And this might be a little bit odd to see a hand like, or myself using a hand like this as the slow play for both players, because you might think, well, it doesn't have a flush draw, and generally speaking, our slow plays, they probably want to have like a hand like a set and a nut flush draw, a straight and a nut flush draw. But the problem is here, it's such a low SPR scenario, neither player is actually folding a flush draw. And so we don't actually, well, the solver doesn't really care about pushing or basically having a flush draw when he's slow playing, because we're not pushing out any flush draws by betting. And thus, I like to check back a hand like this. There is, of course, going to be a lot of slow playing with hands like the nut straight and the nut flush draw, for example. But I just thought I would use this hand to illustrate that concept, as I mentioned before. And because we have a slow, we are at a low SPR and we have a polarized checking range, it does mean that our betting range for both plays is going to be quite worse. And neither player is going to check, or pretty much never going to check a hand like aces and the nut flush draw that isn't better than a hand like 8-5. So basically, if we had a hand like ace, ace, 3, deuce, deuce with a nut flush draw, basically any hand that doesn't include a straight or two pair that has aces and the nut flush draw will always bet from both players. This hand really benefits from the minimal amount of fold equity both players have. Obviously, the in-position player has more, because you can push out some hands that have equity against us, and we're also never folding out a hand that we dominate, because as I mentioned before, every time any player has a flush draw facing a bet, they are always stacking off. So again, both players always betting 100% of these hands here. So let's move on to monotone board textures, and this is going to be one of the few textures where we do decide to employ a small betting strategy and not a large betting strategy. So why is this going to be the case? Well, as on most static board textures in low SPR scenarios, we don't really use a large sizings because we don't want to push out hands that we dominate. So if we have the nuts or the effective nuts, let's say like the nut flush draw in this example, we don't really benefit from betting big because we're going to push out hands that we do very well against, like a pair and a straight draw. Let's say a hand like a pair and a wrap would be always forced to continue against a very, very small sizing, and we can extract a lot of value. We don't benefit from pushing that hand out, and by potting, we would isolate ourselves against a range that has, yes, we would still be ahead against, but these hands like a set, a lot of the time are going to have some equity against us, and it's just going to not be the highest EV approach. And also on a lot of board textures, it's not like we're going to have a significant equity advantage either, unless we're on an ace-high board. So it's not like we can really leverage our equity by using this large sizing and getting protection with our sets and two pairs. We don't really have a set or two pair advantage on most monotone board textures unless it is ace-high. And even if you think about as well the in-position player, just because when the cutoff checks, he's going to have probably more nut flushes and potentially some more sets and two pairs. He again really doesn't like betting too much in the scenario because again, he is pushing up all those hands that he does dominate. So as a result, we start using a very small sizing with a relatively polarized betting approach. Both players, as I mentioned before, are going to be checking at a very high frequency of around 60%. And this again also has to do with the fact that the blocker effects on monotone boards are going to be fairly strong. So if we have a flush, for example, especially the nut flush, it makes it very unlikely that our opponent is going to continue because a lot of his range is going to contain a flush or some kind of flush draw blocker. So that's something we have to pay close attention to. And I also want to just bring up this equity graph here. You can see on 8-6 deuce, the out position player is checking 66% and the in position player is checking 60%. you can see here that even though the ad position player, again, has that polarity advantage up the top part of the graph, he doesn't really have much of an equity advantage. So again, he doesn't really benefit from using a large sizing and pushing out straight draws if he has a set or a flush draw, or sorry, a set or a two pair, I should say. And again, a small sizing is going to be the play. And in terms of our overall strategy on these boards, what we should think about if we want to bet, for example, is consider a few different things. So if we have a strong hand, does our strong hand block our opponent's continues? Obviously, if we have a strong hand like a flush, we don't really want to be blocking hands like a straight draw, like a two pair, like a set, because it makes it extremely likely that our opponent is going to fold, and that's what we would prefer to check and hope our opponent bluffs. And in the solver, neither player is ever betting a hand like a flush with a two pair set on this board texture example of 8-6 deuce. So that's something to consider when we have a strong hand. And if we have a weak hand, we obviously want to consider things like, does our hand block our opponent's continuing range? That's obviously quite important. But also, we want to consider whether we fold out any hands that we dominate. If we had a hand like, let's say, aces and a wrap, for example, that's probably, without having looked at the solution, it's probably a hand we would want to go ahead and check, because we don't want to isolate ourselves against our opponent's stronger range by betting. He could have some flushes, and thus our straight draw becomes ineffective. But because we have a hand like aces and the wrap, for example, we don't really, we probably end up pushing out a hand, maybe like a pair, a weak pair, for example, that we're doing very well against. And that's obviously very bad for us if we are only folding out worse hands and getting called by better hands. So that's something to consider when we do approach these textures on monotone boards. In terms of paired board textures, Fabian already did a video on this. So if you want to check out how to play paired boards in particular, check out his video on 4BetPots out of position on paired boards. So we'll finish up by going into a summary and start off with, we talked about unpaired boards first of all. And the cutoff player is basically able to simplify to shoving all of his board textures. And in terms of the in-position strategy, he is going to be folding a lot more on textures that are more disconnected, and obviously the ace-high board textures that are going to be frequent folding as well. We had a look at straight board textures, and they're often going to be very high frequency checks for the cutoff, unless they're very the ace-high boards, or they're very low because they fail to interact with the in-position range. But that's generally not going to be the case. Most straight boards will result in a high amount of checks on the cutoff, especially ones that center around the Broadway cards. Ones that don't make a ace-high straight in particular are very good for the in-position player. And it's going to result in a polarized betting approach for the out of position, or polarized checking approach, I should say, on these board textures as the out of position player. And the in position player, because he has a very good interaction on these board textures, we end up betting quite frequently. I should also mention, in terms of the polarized checking approach, that's obviously dependent on the board texture in question. If we are checking 80% of hands, we obviously don't have a polarized checking approach. We can probably simplify to a range check, but this is more the case if we had, say, betting frequency of 30%, let's say. And both players on monotone boards have high frequency checks. We don't really have much incentive to bet very much on monotone board textures, as we talked about before. We don't want to push out hands we dominate, and we also don't want to isolate ourselves against hands that have a lot of equity against us or are ahead. And thus, we don't benefit from using a large size. We are only going to use a 1/5 pot size bets. And the most important thing to think about is that when we want to bet, consider the efficiency of our hands. Do we push out hands that we dominate? Do we only get called by worse? If we have a strong hand, are we blocking the hands that we're targeting, for example? All of these things we should be considering, and you can certainly notice these patterns if you go into the PLO trainer. Hopefully the solutions will be out by the time this video is on the website. So thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. Let me know what you thought, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.